Tonight, we return to the world of Westeros. It is a world of stone and sky, of great halls warmed by firelight, and long roads stretching pale between the trees. A world where the seasons last for years, and the cold has memory. Where ravens carry messages between castles, and the names of old families are spoken with the weight of everything those families have built and broken. But before that, my name's Murphy, and I'd love to know where you're listening from, and what time of day it is for you. If this brings you calm, don't forget to subscribe. There are so many more peaceful nights ahead. We have already spent some time here. We know the shape of it, more or less. Ned Stark has arrived in King's Landing with the reluctance of a man who agreed to something before he fully understood what he was agreeing to. His daughter Arya is there with him, bored and restless in the way that she tends to be in rooms that don't fit her. Sansa is there too, wide-eyed and hopeful, believing in the version of the capital she had imagined from the stories. Jon Snow has ridden north towards the Wall, carrying the complicated feelings of someone sent away from home, but not quite yet belonging anywhere else. And young Bran Stark lies still in a room in Winterfell, his future uncertain, his mother sitting by his side and refusing to leave. The Wall is not something you can really prepare yourself for. You can hear descriptions of it. 700 feet of ice, they say. The largest structure in the world, the northern edge of everything. But descriptions don't carry the actual feeling of standing at the base of it and looking up, the way it rises out of the earth, like something the earth decided to make rather than anything men built, even though men did build it long ago, with effort and frost and purpose that has mostly been forgotten. The ice of the Wall is not white, it is blue, in the way that very old ice is blue. A deep, quiet blue that catches the morning light and holds it for a moment before letting it go. In the summer months, such as they are this far north, the surface of the Wall weeps slowly, thin rivulets of water running down its face and freezing again before they get very far. The sound of it, if you stand close enough, is a soft and constant trickle, almost peaceful in its way. Castle Black sat at the Wall's base, like something that had been pressed against it and left there. It was not a beautiful castle. It had never been meant to be beautiful. It was functional in the manner of a tool kept just sharp enough to do its work, repaired when necessary, maintained without particular love, serving its purpose with the grim consistency of a place that had seen many men come and go and expected to see many more. The towers were uneven, the courtyard was unpaved, packed earth that turned to mud when the Wall wept and hardened again when the cold came back. The great hall had long tables and a hearth that smelled of 100 years of use. Jon Snow had been here only a short time, but he had learned the feel of the place quickly, the way young men do when they have no choice but to learn it. He rose in the dark every morning with the other recruits, pulled on wool and leather in the cold of the dormitory, and made his way out to the training yard before full light. The yard was lit in the early morning by torches set into iron brackets along the wall, their flames moving in the wind that came down from the north with no warning and no apology. The recruits he'd trained alongside were not what he had expected. He had not known exactly what he expected, but they were different from it. Some were men who had been given a choice between the Wall and something worse. Men who had committed crimes too serious to walk away from and too small for the headsman's attention. Some were younger, his own age or close, sent north by families who had too many sons or not enough food or other reasons they hadn't fully explained. A handful were genuinely willing, men who had come to the watch with some idea of purpose, of service, of guarding the realm from what lay beyond. They were, in the main, untrained. That was the word for it. Not bad, particularly. Just untrained, in the specific way of people who had never been taught how to do the thing they were now being asked to do. They held swords without knowing how swords worked. They moved in the yard without knowing how their bodies were supposed to move. They were learning from the beginning. Jon was not learning from the beginning. He had trained in the yard at Winterfell since he was old enough to be given a wooden sword and shown where to stand. He had drilled alongside Robb Stark year after year, and Robb was not an easy opponent. He was quick and competitive, and trained by the same men who had trained his father. Jon had learned proper footwork, proper stance, the way to hold your body when you engage, and the way to move your feet when you need to change direction quickly. He had not thought much about this knowledge while he was acquiring it. It had simply become part of him, the way any skill you practice long enough becomes part of you. And in the training yard at Castle Black, among men who were learning it all from scratch, the difference was immediately visible. When the morning sessions began, and the recruits were paired off to spar, Jon moved into it with an ease that was almost unremarkable in its confidence, unhurried, not aggressive, simply sure. He read his opponents before they moved. He anticipated where a swing was coming from, and moved before it arrived. He could adjust mid-motion in ways that the other recruits couldn't manage because their bodies hadn't learned to move that way yet. He worked through the sparring sessions with a kind of steady patience, and the outcomes were consistent. He never made a show of it. That was important to notice. He didn't preen after a win, didn't speak to his opponent about what they had done wrong, didn't look around the yard to see who was watching. He simply did what he was there to do, and then waited to do it again. But the yard would go quiet eventually. People stopped their own sparring to watch. There was the particular stillness that a crowd makes when it has seen enough to know it is watching something worth watching. Sir Alliser Thorne was always watching. Thorne was the master-at-arms at Castle Black, which meant he was the man responsible for turning these recruits into something resembling soldiers. He was lean and long-faced, with the manner of someone who had formed his opinions about the world and its inhabitants many years ago, and saw no reason to revise them. He carried himself with the rigid posture of a man who believes that softness, in any form, is a kind of weakness, and that weakness, in any form, deserves contempt. He had a gift for contempt. It was, perhaps, the most genuine thing about him, the most specific, the most personal, the most finely calibrated. He knew which words would cut, and where they would cut the deepest, and he chose them with the care of someone who considers this a skill worth cultivating. He called Jon Snow by a name he had given him, Lord Snow, not as a compliment. It was said in the way that nicknames are sometimes said, with just enough inflection to make the mockery clear without ever making it deniable. Lord Snow. As if the title was a joke, as if the name itself was a kind of joke. A bastard, Thorne made clear, from a family of prominence, walking into a yard full of men who had nothing, and beating them with the advantages of a life they had never had. As if that was something to be admired. He told Jon this plainly. He told him that what he'd done in the yard was not impressive, because his opponents were not impressive opponents. They were, in Thorne's deliberate phrase, boys. Soft, hungry, untrained boys. Defeating them meant nothing. And if Jon had come to the wall expecting to be celebrated for something, he had simply been born into the training, the resources, the Winterfell yard. He was going to find the wall a disappointing mirror for his expectations. Jon heard all of this. He held it steady, the way he tended to hold things, in a quiet place, without letting it show on his face. He was 17 and had been managing the complicated business of being Ned Stark's bastard son for his entire life, which meant he had some practice at absorbing things other people said about him, and not responding in the ways they perhaps hoped he would. He said very little to Thorne. There was not much to say. Later, when the yard had cleared and the torches were burning lower against the afternoon light, Jon found himself in conversation with the last person he had expected to find at the wall. Tyrion Lannister had not been one of the figures who dominated Jon's imagination of the wall before he arrived. He had known, in a vague way, that Tyrion had come north with his brother and the royal party, the visit that accompanied the king's arrival at Winterfell. But here Tyrion was, at Castle Black, apparently having decided to see the wall himself, rather than simply know that it existed. He was shorter than Jon remembered, which was saying something. He had the particular comfort of a man who has long since made his peace with being stared at, and no longer cares very much about it. He dressed well, in the easy way of someone for whom good clothing is so routine as to require no thought. He had a goblet of wine, and the impression of a man settling in for a conversation he expected to enjoy. He spoke to Jon without the usual social layering that most adults used when speaking to someone of Jon's age and position. He did not talk around things. He had, he said, a natural sympathy for bastards and dwarves and broken things, people who had been handed a certain kind of status by the world before they could do anything about it, who carried that status everywhere they went, like a coat that fit badly and couldn't be removed. He was direct about this, and the directness of it was its own kind of respect. He said that the trick of it, the only thing he'd found that actually worked, was to claim it. To take the thing the world had decided was your disadvantage, and name it yourself, loudly, before anyone else could name it quietly. Wear it like armor, he said. Let it be your own before it can be used against you. It didn't take the difficulty away, but it changed the shape of it. He had done this himself, more or less, his whole life. Jon thought about this. He had not heard it said this way before. He had known it, in the blurry way you know things you haven't yet put into words. But hearing it said plainly was a different thing. It settled into him somewhere. Tyrion finished his wine. He had seen what he came to see. He was going south. The road away from Castle Black is not a comfortable one in any direction. Heading south, you pass first through the village at the base of the wall, a cluster of buildings that huddles close together the way settlements do in cold places, as if the buildings themselves are trying to stay warm. The village serves the watch in the practical way of a service town. Inns that are rarely full, a few traders who know the road well, people who have simply lived here long enough that the cold has stopped being remarkable. Beyond the village, the road stretches through forest. Dark trees, mostly spruce and pine, the kind that don't lose their needles in winter and so remain green year-round, a green so deep it looks almost black in the shade. Tyrion rode with Yoren, a man of the Night's Watch, who moved between Castle Black and the south with the practiced ease of someone who has made a journey so many times it has stopped being a journey and become simply what Tuesday is. Yoren was weathered in the way of men who work outdoors in all weather. Not dramatically, just thoroughly. He was not a talker, which Tyrion did not mind. Tyrion could talk enough for two people and often did. The miles passed. The country changed as they moved south. The trees thinned slightly. The air shifted from the particular sharp cold of the far north to a cold that was still serious, but had a little more give to it. The sky opened up where the forest broke. By the time they reached the approaches to Winterfell, the world looked different enough from Castle Black that it might have been a different world entirely. Tyrion stopped at Winterfell. There was something there he wanted to see to. Winterfell was quiet in the way that houses are quiet when something heavy has settled over them. Not a bad quiet, exactly. More the quiet of a household that has absorbed a shock and is still finding its way back to normal. The great yard was functioning. The forge was working. The servants moved through their routines. But there was a weight to it. The weight of what had happened to Bran, still present, still thick in the air of the corridors. Catelyn Stark was mostly near her son's room. Robb was managing the household with the careful seriousness of a young man who has been given responsibilities he wasn't quite expecting, and is determined not to fail them. He walked through the castle with an uprightness that was slightly more deliberate than his father's, as if he was reminding himself to stand straight. Tyrion moved through Winterfell with the easy manner of a guest who is comfortable in other people's houses in ways that some guests aren't. He could read a room quickly. Who was where, what the mood was, what was and wasn't being said. He had been thinking on the road from Castle Black about Bran, about what it would mean to be a boy who had spent his life climbing and running and riding, suddenly immobile, about what the world might look like from that bed, with that ceiling, in those long hours. He had turned the problem over in his head the way he turned problems over, by thinking about it from different angles, discarding what didn't work, keeping what did. And he had arrived at something he thought might be useful. The saddle he had designed was specific to the situation. It wasn't a modification of a normal saddle. It was a fundamentally different approach to the question of how a person rides when the grip of the legs is gone. The weight distribution was different. The support was built into the seat itself, rather than relying on the rider's lower body to do the work. The frame was designed to hold a person steady through the movement of the horse, to account for the things a paralyzed rider could not account for themselves. He drew it out of the measurements, the angles, the construction. He was not a craftsman himself, but he understood enough about how things were built to describe the building of them with enough clarity that a skilled craftsman could follow it. He gave the drawings to Robb. He explained what they were for, quietly, and without making it more dramatic than it was. Robb listened with the expression of someone hearing something unexpected. Before there was any ceremony about it, Tyrion was gone. He had a way of completing a thing and moving on before the completion became a moment anyone had to perform around. He was back on his horse and on the road south by the time anyone had fully processed that he'd been and gone. The road south from Winterfell is long. The country around it is open in ways that some of the more forested regions of Westeros are not. Rolling country, mostly grassland and low hills, the sky very present overhead. In the late afternoon, the light comes at a low angle and makes the grass look almost gold. It is the kind of landscape that feels settled, old, uncomplicated. The kind you can look at for a long time without the looking becoming a thing you have to work at. Tyrion looked at it. He was heading back toward warmth and wine and conversation, and the complicated life of a Lannister in a world that had a lot of complicated opinions about Lannisters. But he was, for the moment, on a road in the north, and the road was quiet, and the sky was clear. And that was enough. Far from Westeros, on the other side of the narrow sea, the Dothraki Khalasar moved across the grass in its great, slow way. The Khalasar was always in motion. That was one of the first things Daenerys had understood about Dothraki life. Or rather, it was one of the first things she had felt about it, before she had words for it. They did not stay. The world was not a place to be rooted in, but a place to move through, endlessly. The horses beneath them and the sky above, and the grass on all sides, as far as the eye could find an edge. There was a rhythm to it, once you stopped being unsettled by it. The sound of hooves, steady and muffled on the soft ground. The particular smell of a large group of horses in warm weather. The way the light moved across the open land through the day, changing the color of everything hour by hour. Daenerys rode at the front with Khal Drogo, which was the place of a Khaleesi. She had learned this fact before she had learned very much else. The place of the Khaleesi was at the front. That was the position. The visible, public position. What the position actually meant. What it required of her. What she was supposed to be while she was there. These were things that took considerably longer to understand. Her marriage to Drogo had been arranged by her brother, delivered to Drogo as part of a negotiation, and accepted by Drogo for reasons that had nothing to do with Daenerys herself. She had been given before she had any say in the giving, and the giving had set her down in this life, among these people, beside this man who was as foreign to her as a creature from a story. He was not cruel, exactly. Drogo operated at a level of assumption about how the world worked that left no room for cruelty as a deliberate choice, because cruelty implies considering the other person's experience and deciding against it. He simply lived as he lived, and she was part of that now, and he had not thought much about the adjustment it required. The adjustment had been real. Daenerys had been cold in ways that went beyond temperature. She had been lonely in the specific way of someone surrounded by people who speak a language she doesn't understand. She had felt, in the early weeks, as though she had been handed someone else's life and was wearing it the way you wear an outfit that doesn't fit. Everything slightly wrong. Nothing landing the way it was supposed to. Doreah was the one who began to change this. Doreah was one of the handmaidens who had come with Daenerys from her previous life. A young woman with a calm and careful manner, a readiness to observe things before judging them, and a quality of patience that was unusual and genuine. She had come from a particular background that had taught her a great deal about people and what they needed from each other, and she applied this knowledge without calling attention to it. She and Daenerys had begun to talk in the quieter hours of the day, in the late afternoon, when the Khalasar had settled for a time, or in the early evening, while the camp arranged itself around the cooking fires. Their conversations were honest in the way that conversations between women can be when the social performances aren't required. No need to be impressive. No need to be anything particular. Just two people talking about what was actually true. What Doreah helped Daenerys find was not technique exactly. It was not a set of instructions. It was more like a way of seeing herself differently. She helped Daenerys understand that confidence is not something that arrives from outside, not a quality that gets bestowed on you when other people decide you deserve it. It is a decision, a private one, made in the interior where no one else can see it, and then carried into the world in how you stand and how you speak, and where your eyes go, and how long they stay. Daenerys had been carrying herself like someone waiting for permission. The permission was not going to come. No one was going to hand it to her. She had to decide she was a Khaleesi, and then be one, and the only difference between those two things was inside her. This sounds like a small thing. It is not a small thing. She began, slowly and without announcement, to change how she moved through the world of the Khalasar. She sat differently in the saddle. She spoke differently, less as a question, more as a statement. She looked at people, and she held the look, which is a different kind of message than looking, and then looking away. She engaged with the women of the Khalasar more directly, spent time among them without the removed quality she had had at the beginning. She was learning their language, too, slowly, word by word, in the patient way that you can only really learn a language when you are living inside it every day. Drogo noticed. He was not a man given to expressions of surprise, but there was a quality of attention he gave her that had not been there in the same way before. Something had changed in her bearing, and it had registered with him in a way that changed the quality of his attention, not dramatically, not with speeches, simply with the particular awareness of someone who has noticed that the person beside them has become more present than they were before. Their relationship shifted, degree by degree, in ways that Daenerys was partly guiding and partly discovering. She was finding that confidence in one area made confidence in another area less difficult to reach. Each thing she did that felt like herself, rather than a performance of someone else's idea of herself, made the next thing a little easier. It was slow, it was real, and it was becoming the most important thing happening to Daenerys Targaryen, thousands of miles from the world that still thought of her as a pawn in her brother's game. King's Landing was never quiet. That was one of the things Ned had noticed immediately, and had not yet made peace with. Winterfell had its sounds. The forge, the dogs, the wind through the high corridors. But those sounds had a rhythm, a regularity that let the spaces between them be actual silence. King's Landing had no spaces between sounds. There were too many people, too many streets, too many wagons and voices, and animals and trades being conducted at all hours in all directions. The city was always in the middle of something, always at the height of some transaction, or argument, or celebration, or delivery. It did not pause. Ned moved through it with the expression of a man who had agreed to something and was now experiencing the full scope of what he'd agreed to. The small council met in a room off the main hall of the Red Keep. A table, chairs, windows that looked out over the city and the bay beyond it. The council was the practical machinery of the kingdom, the group of men who handled the actual operations of ruling, while the king handled the visible parts of ruling, which mostly involved being large and loud, and present in the right rooms at the right times. The two functions were separate, and both necessary. The men around the table had the particular quality of people who have been doing something for a long time, and have developed strong private opinions about it. Lord Petter Baelish, Littlefinger, as he was known, a name with a history behind it, served as master of coin. He had the appearance of a man who had curated his appearance carefully and successfully, neat, polished, faintly amused by everything, as if the world were a game he had been playing longer than anyone else and was no longer surprised by. He spoke about money with the easy fluency of someone who has never had to think about whether he has enough of it. What he told Ned in that first council meeting was not what Ned had expected to hear. The crown was in debt, not moderately in debt. Not the kind of debt that could be managed with careful planning and a few years of sensible spending. The kind of debt that had been accumulating for years, quietly, through the gap between what the crown spent and what the crown had. The Iron Bank of Braavos, the most serious lender in the known world. Serious in the specific sense of an institution that views its money with a patience and a long memory that governments tend to underestimate, held a significant portion of the debt. The Lannisters held the rest, or a large part of the rest, which was a particular kind of arrangement given that the Queen was a Lannister and had opinions about the kingdom's obligations to her family. Ned sat with this. He was not comfortable with it. He was from the north, where the practicalities of running a household required that you spent what you had and not much more, because there was no one to bail you out if you miscalculated. The idea of a kingdom spending money it didn't have on a tournament. A tournament that Robert had decided to hold in Ned's honor, with prize money that ran to tens of thousands of gold dragons, sat across from his nature like something he didn't know how to be in the same room with. He said so. He argued, in his direct and precise way, that the tournament should not happen, that the money didn't exist, that holding a celebration that required borrowing was adding a problem to the problems already present. The council listened to him with varying degrees of attention. The council did not agree. The tournament would go ahead. Ned did not argue further. He noted the outcome and moved on to the thing that had been pulling at him since before he left Winterfell. Jon Arryn was dead. The man who had held the position of Hand of the King before Ned. The man who had been, in fact, like a father to Ned in the years when Ned needed one. Dead. The official reason was illness, a fever that came quickly and was quickly fatal. The city had accepted this. The small council had moved on from it with the practiced efficiency of groups of people who have learned that the machinery keeps running regardless of who is manning which part of it. But Jon Arryn had been asking questions before he died. He had been looking into things. He had borrowed a book, a genealogical record, a listing of the great families and their bloodlines going back through the generations. And he had been reading it carefully, in the way of someone who is not reading for interest, but is looking for something specific. He had been visiting people in the city, in the way that someone visits people when they are trying to quietly collect pieces of a picture they are trying to put together. Ned began to ask the same questions, not loudly, not with announcement. He simply started paying attention, started following threads, started moving through King's Landing in a way that was more investigative than his position strictly required. Varys was aware of this. Varys was the master of whisperers, a title that was polite for what the role actually was. He ran an information network. He had sources in places that people would be surprised to hear he had sources, and he had maintained these sources with the particular discipline of someone who understands that information is a currency more stable than gold. He moved through the halls of the Red Keep softly, in his quiet robes, with his quiet voice, and his bald head, and his perpetually mild expression. He observed things with the attention of a scholar, not aggressive, not predatory, simply attentive, the way a very good reader is attentive to a text. He watched Ned Stark begin his investigation into Jon Arryn's death, and he watched it with something that could have been concern, or could have been admiration, or could have been a mixture of the two that he had not yet decided what to do with. He had a habit of appearing in corridors when you hadn't quite expected him to appear. He said things that were pointed, specific, more than they seemed at first, and then glided away, leaving the pointed thing behind to do its work. He was not reckless with information. He did not share things carelessly. Every piece of information that Varys shared had been selected for a purpose, even if the purpose was not immediately obvious to the person receiving it. What Varys shared with Ned in their early conversations was not much. A suggestion here, a name there, a way of looking at a situation that was slightly different from the way Ned had been looking at it. Varys was a man who operated at several removes from directness, who found it more interesting and more useful to point at something from an angle than to walk straight toward it. Ned, who was by nature a person of direct angles, found this approach somewhat difficult to navigate. He was used to men who said what they meant, and meant what they said. Varys said things that meant what they meant, plus several other things simultaneously. and the sorting of what was being communicated from what was being left uncommunicated took concentration. He noted all of it. He noted Varys the way he was noting everything in King's Landing. Carefully, without reaching conclusions he hadn't yet earned the right to reach. Ned was not sure yet what to make of Varys. He was not sure he was supposed to be sure. There was a room in the Red Keep where girls were taught to sew. It was a pleasant room. Good light, decent furniture, the right kind of order to it. The instructors were patient in the way of people who have spent many years teaching the same lesson and have made their peace with the range of aptitude they encounter. The thread came in many colors. The work produced was, in the hands of girls who were suited for it, quite beautiful. Small flowers and birds and patterns, stitched with a precision that required real concentration and care. Arya Stark sat at the wrong angle and held her needle the wrong way, and produced stitches that her teacher looked at with an expression that was doing a great deal of work. Arya was small and dark-haired and 11 years old, and had the quality of someone who had arrived in the wrong room. Not because she was bad, or difficult, or unwilling. She was none of those things in any general sense. But the needlework room required a particular kind of patience. A patience with small, still things. And Arya was built for entirely different kinds of patience. The kind you needed when you were paying attention to something that moved. She thought about Needle. The sword Jon had given her before she left Winterfell, thin and light, made for someone her size. She had it hidden somewhere safe, wrapped and stored in a place where no one who would object to its presence would find it. She thought about it the way you think about the thing you want when you're stuck doing something else. Not obsessively, but persistently, the way certain thoughts just keep coming back. Ned saw his younger daughter and understood something. He was a man who had raised children and paid attention while doing it, and he could read Arya with the clarity that comes from actually looking at a person rather than looking at the idea of them. He saw what she was. He saw what was and wasn't going to work for her. He made an arrangement. He hired a man. His name was Syrio Forel, and he was from Braavos. Braavos is a city of many things, and one of the things it is known for is a particular tradition of swordsmanship. A school of fighting called water dancing, which is a name that sounds softer than it is. The Braavosi style was built around speed rather than strength, movement rather than force. It was a different way of thinking about a fight, built on the idea that the most effective thing you can do with your body in a dangerous situation is move it precisely and quickly rather than hit hard. It required balance and coordination and a kind of spatial awareness that some people have to build and some people simply come with. Syrio came with the bearing of a man who had spent 40 years being very good at something and had arrived at a quality of calm about it that went past confidence. He was older, with a shaved head and an expressive face that moved through a great range of expression quickly. Amused, sharp, attentive, gently sardonic, without ever losing its fundamental composure. He looked at Arya when they met in the large stone room that would become their practice space, and he looked at her with actual attention, not the patient indulgence of a teacher managing a student who was there because they had to be. Real attention, the kind that notices things. They began with basics. Syrio did not rush. He had the teacher's understanding that the basics, done correctly, are worth more than anything that comes after them done incorrectly, and that most problems in a student come from somewhere foundational that was never properly established. He watched how Arya stood, how she held herself, where she put her weight. He corrected things immediately, but without punishment. A word. a touch to adjust the angle of an elbow, a demonstration with his own body of what he was describing. He taught her about feet first. Where you put your feet is most of what you are in a physical contest. Your feet are what connect you to the floor, and if your connection to the floor is wrong, everything built on top of it will be wrong. He showed her the stance he wanted. He watched her copy it. He adjusted. He watched her copy the adjustment. He was patient with this in the way that good teachers are patient. Not resignedly, not through gritted teeth, but genuinely, because he understood that the time spent on this now was what made everything later possible. Arya was not immediately good. She was not supposed to be. She was learning how to hold her body in a new way, which is something that takes time to settle into the muscle, so it stops being something you think about and starts being something you just do. She made mistakes in the morning and came home from the sessions slightly tired in the way that good physical work makes you tired. A clean tiredness in the body rather than in the spirit. There were days she went back to her room after a session and replayed a movement in her head. What Syrio had said to adjust it, what her feet had been doing wrong, how the correction was supposed to feel different from what she'd been doing before. This was new for her, the thinking through of physical things in the after hours. It was different from the needlework room in every way she could name, and also in ways she couldn't quite articulate. In the needlework room, the hours dragged, and she spent them wanting to be somewhere else. In the large stone room with Syrio, the hours moved differently. Fast in the way that engaged time moves fast, where you look up and are surprised by how much of it has passed. She would arrive in the morning, and the light would be coming in at one angle, and she would look up at some point, and the light would be at a different angle entirely, and she would not have noticed the transition. But she was learning in a way she hadn't been able to learn in the needlework room. There was a rightness to this, a click of fit between what was being asked of her and the person she actually was. She was paying attention in a full way, not the effortful, uphill attention she'd been managing in other lessons, but the kind that comes naturally, because the thing you're paying attention to is the right thing. Syrio taught her something in one of their early sessions that she carried forward. He talked about fear, about what to say to fear when it arrived. He was not a man who believed in pretending fear didn't exist, or pushing through it with will. He had a different relationship with it. His view was that fear was something you spoke to, directly, that you acknowledged it was there, and then you told it, not today, not a declaration, not a performance. Just a quiet and personal word between you and the thing that was trying to stop you. Arya held on to this. She was not going to be good at needlework. She had made peace with that. But in the large stone room with the good light, with Syrio Forel watching her footwork and adjusting her grip, she was becoming, slowly, something else. A new recruit arrived at Castle Black by wagon. His name was Samwell Tarly, and his arrival was not the kind that made an impression in a positive direction. He was heavy-set and soft-looking, wrapped in a travelling cloak that was slightly too large for him, and his face had the expression of a person who has been afraid of something for a while, and has grown tired of being afraid, without being any less afraid. He moved slowly, carefully, as if each new ground he put his foot on might turn out to be a trap. He had not come to the wall by choice. He had been sent by his father, Lord Eddard Stark, a man of military reputation and very particular ideas about what his eldest son was supposed to be. Sam was not what his father had in mind. Sam was bookish and gentle, and disinterested in hunting and fighting, and the other activities that his father considered essential to the kind of man the Tarly family produced. His father had made clear, over many years and with considerable directness, that he considered Sam an embarrassment. And then, eventually, his father had made a more practical decision. If Sam would not agree to go to the wall and join the Night's Watch voluntarily, he would have an accident instead. The choice, delivered in those terms, left very little room for deliberation. Sam had chosen the wall, and so here he was, climbing down from a wagon in the courtyard of Castle Black, looking at his new home with the expression of someone who has been told they're going somewhere worse, and is now confirming that yes, it is indeed worse. He was afraid of the cold. He was afraid of the yard. He was afraid of the other recruits, who were, most of them, exactly the kind of men that fear most in an enclosed space. He had never been in a fight, and had no desire to start. He didn't know how to hold a sword in any meaningful sense. He moved slowly in the drills and fell behind, and was the last person done at almost every task. And he was aware of all of this, and the awareness of it made him more nervous, which made the performances worse, which made him more aware, which made him more nervous. It was a cycle he couldn't find the exit from. The other recruits found him quickly. Groups under pressure do this. They look for the person most clearly marked as different, as outside the group's idea of itself, and they push on that person in a way that makes themselves feel slightly more inside. It is not admirable behavior, but it is understandable behavior, and it was the behavior that a subset of the Castle Black recruits directed at Sam. They were harder on him in sparring than they needed to be. They made comments in the common hall. They made the particular kind of small and targeted discomfort that people make when they want to be unpleasant without being formally responsible for being unpleasant. Jon Snow watched this happen, and he didn't like it. He had been watching Sam since the wagon arrived. He noticed things about people. It was a quality that came from years of being in a position where you needed to read a room quickly to know where you stood. And what he noticed about Sam was that the things that made him easy to dismiss in the yard were only part of the picture. Sam talked about things he'd read with the ease of someone for whom ideas are as natural as breathing. He was genuinely kind, in the unguarded way of someone who hasn't learned to be careful about their kindness yet. He was honest. He was warm. He paid attention to the people around him in a way that most of the recruits didn't. None of that was going to protect him in the training yard. But it was real, and it was worth protecting. Jon spoke to the recruits who had been making things difficult. He was direct about it. He spoke without raising his voice, without making a performance of it, in the plain and uncomplicated way that some people can deliver serious messages. The words arrived, and they landed, and they meant what they said. Sam was part of this group now. He was their brother, which was the word the Night's Watch used for its members, and the word meant something. Brothers didn't do this to each other. That was going to stop. Sir Alistair Thorne heard about this, or saw it, and was not pleased in the specific way that Thorne was not pleased by things controlled, deliberate, expressing itself through the mechanism of publicly calling Jon out in the yard. Thorne told Jon that he was interfering with the natural process by which weak men were identified and dealt with, that his sentiment, however well-intentioned, was the kind of thing that got people killed beyond the wall when the moment came. That coddling a man who was not cut out for this made no one safer. Jon listened. He did not entirely dismiss what Thorne was saying. There was a grain of something in it, if you separated it from Thorne's specific enjoyment of saying it. But he also knew the difference between hardship that built something and hardship that simply broke things. What was being done to Sam was the second kind. He held his ground on it. He did not argue past what needed arguing. He simply stayed where he was. And something shifted in him through all of this. It came on quietly, the way most real changes come on. Not as a sudden decision, but as a growing sense of something that had been becoming clear for a while, and finally arrived at the surface. Jon had come to the wall carrying the accumulated advantages of his particular life. The training yard at Winterfell, the attention of men who took the work seriously, the food and warmth and space of a great house. He had come in and been immediately better than the men around him at the one thing they were all being asked to do together. And some part of him had felt that this was natural, that it was a reflection of who he was. He understood now that it wasn't. It was a reflection of where he had come from. The men he was beating in the yard had not had what he had. They had not had Winterfell, or a master-at-arms who knew what he was doing, or years of careful practice, or enough food. They had had whatever their particular lives had offered them, which for most of them was considerably less. And he had walked in and beaten them, and felt quietly, perhaps, that this was his character on display. It was his circumstances on display. And there was a difference, and it mattered, and once you saw it, you couldn't quite unsee it. Sam helped in his way with this understanding, not through any instruction or wisdom. Sam was not claiming wisdom about this or any related subject, but through simply being himself, plainly and without apology. Through making it clear that the things the Night's Watch valued in a man, and the things that actually made a man valuable, were not perfectly overlapping categories. They talked in the evenings, after the yard had closed and the hall had quieted. Sam talked about what he'd read, history, natural history, accounts of the far north, records of the Night's Watch going back hundreds of years. He talked about it with the ease of someone for whom knowledge is simply enjoyable and does not require a practical justification. He was curious, naturally, and without effort. He asked Jon questions and listened to the answers. He was the kind of person who made the people around him feel that what they were saying was worth listening to, which is a quality that has nothing to do with swords or fighting, and everything to do with the kind of person someone is. Jon found himself looking forward to the evenings in a way he hadn't expected to look forward to much at Castle Black. The wall itself was always present, the cold of it, the sound of it, the very fact of it, 700 feet of ancient ice rising against the sky at the edge of everything. It was easy to forget, in the routine of the yard and the mess hall, that the reason all of this existed was something beyond the wall that had required the building of it in the first place. The forest on the other side was dark and deep and keeping its secrets. The watch patrolled the top of the wall in their rotations, looking north, as they had always looked north. Most of them saw nothing. For now, King's Landing had found something to be excited about, and it was making the most of it. The tournament. The Hands Tournament, held in Ned's name, proceeding over Ned's objections as these things tend to proceed once Robert had decided on them, had brought the city to a particular pitch of anticipation. It had been announced with enough advance notice that people had come from elsewhere, merchants with things to sell to merchants, travelers drawn by spectacle, minor lords who wanted to be seen at the kind of occasion where being seen mattered. The inns were full. The streets leading towards the tournament grounds were thick with people and animals and carts. There was the smell of food cooking, and horses, and people close together. And there was noise, the specific volume of a city in celebration. The tournament grounds were set outside the walls, in a broad field that had been prepared over the preceding days. The lists for the jousting ran down the center. a long, straight track divided by a low fence, wide enough for two riders to run toward each other without their horses colliding. On either side, the viewing stands had been built up in tiers, with fabric overhead to cut the sun, and seats arranged so that more important people sat in more elevated positions, as things tend to be arranged in societies where position matters. Banners moved in the wind along the edges of the field. The stag of House Baratheon was the most prominent, being the royal house. Other houses were represented too, their colours and sigils marking out the competitors and their affiliations. There was a brightness to it in the afternoon light, the kind of brightness that flags and banners have in good weather, which made it look exactly like the kind of thing tournaments are supposed to look like when you imagine them from a distance. Sansa Stark was in the stands with Septa Mordane, and she was looking at it with the eyes of someone for whom the imagination of a thing and the reality of the thing were, for this moment, aligning in a satisfying way. She had grown up hearing about tournaments. She had grown up on the stories, the noble knights and their contests, the formal and beautiful way that honor was supposed to work in the world of this kind of competition. She was 11 years old and the daughter of the Hand of the King, and she was sitting at a tournament in King's Landing, which was exactly where the girl she had been at Winterfell had hoped to be. A young knight had been pointed out to her and introduced, Sir Loras Tyrell, who was known as the Knight of Flowers for reasons that were partly about his sigil and partly about the way he presented himself, with a kind of easy beauty that was uncommon even among knights. He was gallant in the manner of a man who has learned that being gallant is noticed and has decided to be noticed. He spoke to Sansa with the kind of attention that makes you feel, briefly, like the only person in the room. She was charmed. She was 11, and she was charmed. The competition moved through the day in the rhythms of jousting. The preparation, the set, the run, the contact, the outcome. Two riders would line up at opposite ends of the list. They would settle into their saddles, lower their lances, wait for the signal. The horses would start. Large, trained animals, heavy and powerful, moving from stillness into full gallop in the way that their training allowed them to do without excess excitement. The crowd's sound would build as the distance between the riders closed. Sir Gregor Clegane was one of the competitors. He was enormous in the way that made the size of everything around him seem slightly smaller by comparison. His armor was heavy. His horse was larger than most of the other horses. He was a man of violence in the specific way of someone for whom violence is simply a natural state of operation, rather than a tool selected for particular occasions. His reputation had arrived at the tournament before him, in the way that certain reputations do, not through stories exactly, but through an atmosphere, a quality of unease that settled over conversations when his name came up. He was matched against Sir Hugh of the Vale, a young knight who had recently been elevated from squire to knight, an advancement that had come from his service to Jon Arryn, and that had been processed quickly in the weeks after Arryn's death. Sir Hugh was young and not deeply experienced in the kind of contest he was now entering. He had the armor and the horse and the position, but experience is a thing you acquire over time, and there is no shortcut to it. The pass between them was hard in the way that some jousting passes are hard, not a glancing blow, not the kind of contact that a man can be unseated by and then get up from, dust himself off, feel foolish about for a few days and move on. Sir Hugh was struck in the throat, in the specific place where armor was not designed to protect, and where even a piece of good armor could fail a man. He went down. He did not get up in the way that people get up from a fall. The crowd went quiet. Sansa had been watching from the stands. She had been watching with the bright, believing attention of someone who had been excited about the day and had not yet had a reason to adjust that excitement. What happened to Sir Hugh adjusted it. She sat with the image of it, the suddenness of it, the way the afternoon had changed in a single moment, and something in her understanding of the world she was in shifted slightly towards something more complicated and less certain. Ned Stark in the royal box observed everything. He had a quality of observation that was not dramatic. He didn't react outwardly to things, didn't allow his face to do much. He simply noticed and stored what he noticed and continued to notice. He noticed Ser Gregor. He noticed the details of how the collision had occurred. He noticed the people around him and how they were responding or not responding. He was building a picture, steadily, out of everything he saw. The question of Jon Arryn's death had not left Ned's attention, and he was moving through it methodically. He went to see the Grand Maester Pycelle. Pycelle was very old, the kind of old that seems to have been going on for a long time before most people in the room were born. He moved slowly and spoke slowly, and had the particular quality of a man who has outlasted many of the powerful figures he has served and has learned through this experience that the most durable position is the one that doesn't attract too much attention. He was intelligent, clearly, demonstrably, but the intelligence was wrapped in the deliberate manner of someone who had decided long ago that revealing the full extent of it was not always useful. He received Ned in his apartments, which were cluttered in the comfortable way of rooms belonging to someone who has lived in them long enough that the clutter has become part of the decor. There were books and jars of various things, and the particular smell of dried herbs and old paper that attaches to rooms where old men think and read. Ned asked him about Jon Arryn, about his final weeks, his state of mind, the progression of his illness. Pycelle answered in the careful way of a man managing information, giving enough to seem cooperative, holding back enough to maintain control of the conversation. He confirmed that Jon Arryn had seemed troubled before his death, preoccupied with something. He had borrowed a book from the library. Pycelle was specific about this. A large book of lineages, the kind that recorded the bloodlines of the great houses going back many generations. He had spent time with it. He had seemed to be looking for something specific in it, something that mattered to him, though he had not shared what it was. Pycelle said that Jon Arryn's last words, recorded, noted, had been something about needing to tell Robert something, about a duty he had not completed. Ned sat with all of this. He asked about the book. He made arrangements to have it sent to him. He also followed another thread. There was a young man in the city, an apprentice at an armorer's shop, whose name had come to Ned's attention in connection with his investigation. He was called Gendry, and he worked for a craftsman named Tobber Mott, whose shop was in one of the better parts of the craftsman's quarter. A part of the city that smelled of metal and oil and sawdust, and the particular chemical sharpness of materials being worked into shapes they hadn't started as. Ned went there without formal escort. He dressed simply for a man of his position, moved through the streets in the unremarkable way that someone manages when they deliberately choose not to stand out. Tobber Mott's shop was well made, in the sense of a business that had been built on quality over time, and showed it. The armor displayed in the front of the shop had a finish to it that indicated care and skill and patience. Mott himself was a craftsman in the proper sense, skilled, proud of his work in the understated way of people for whom the work itself is the thing, rather than the recognition. He was polite and slightly guarded when Ned arrived, because men in Ned's position don't visit armorers' shops in the craftsman's quarter without a reason, and the reason is rarely that they need armor. He brought out Gendry. Gendry was young, perhaps 14 or 15. and built in the way of someone who had been working in a forge for years, which broadens the shoulders and builds the forearms in a specific and unmistakable way. He had dark hair and blue eyes, and the slightly self-possessed manner of a young man who has not been given much, and has built his own sense of himself without a great deal of help from the world. He was an excellent apprentice, Mott said, with a quiet pride that was genuine rather than performed. The boy had a talent for the work. Ned looked at him. He was looking at more than the boy in front of him. He was looking at the boy in front of him, and something else at the same time, something he was putting together in the space behind his eyes. He asked Gendry a few simple questions, about where he came from, about his mother. The questions were careful, surface level, not revealing what he was actually trying to determine. He thanked Mott. He said something polite and left the shop, and went back into the streets of King's Landing and walked with the expression of a man who has found a piece of something and is now working out where it fits. In the evenings, he read the Book of Lineages. He read the sections on House Baratheon with the attention of a man looking for a pattern. The Baratheons had always produced children with dark hair. The ancestral look of the family, going back generation after generation, consistent and clear. The book confirmed it. Dark hair, dark hair, dark hair. This was how the blood ran, reliably, through the family. He thought about the boy in the armorer's shop. Dark hair, blue eyes, built strongly, the face of someone. He thought about Joffrey, the crown prince, who had fair hair like his mother. Blonde, light, Lannister-looking. He thought about the book, and what the book said about what the Baratheon blood produced. He did not yet say out loud what he was thinking, but he kept reading, night after night, very carefully, turning pages in a quiet room, while the city outside went on being loud and unknowing around him. The saddle had been built. The craftsmen at Winterfell were good at their work. They had been making and repairing things in service of the household for years, and they knew how to follow a plan and execute it precisely. The design Tyrion had left, drawn out in his careful and specific way, was followed with the attention that things made for Bran tended to be made with, because the household wanted to do right by him. When the saddle was ready, and it was brought to Bran, and shown to him and explained. What it was for, how it worked, how the balance of it was designed to compensate for the things his legs could no longer contribute. There was a moment. Bran had been in his room for a long time. The room was familiar to him now, in the way that a room becomes familiar, when it is the only room you inhabit. The cracks in the ceiling, the quality of the light at different hours, the sounds that came in through the window, depending on the wind direction. He had spent those weeks in the inward space that bedridden children inhabit, part of the world and separated from it at the same time. The saddle was a door, not a door back to the way things were. That door was closed, and he knew it, in the way that children often understand facts about their situations more clearly than the adults around them assume. But a door to something. The idea that there was still movement available to him, that the world outside his window was not a place he had been permanently separated from. He could be carried to a horse. He could be helped into the saddle. He could sit up there, with the right support, and the horse would move, and he would move with it. This was not a small thing for a boy who had spent his whole life in motion. Something in his face changed when it was explained to him. Not the uncomplicated excitement of the boy who had run through the yard and climbed the towers of Winterfell without thinking much about either. Something quieter, more considered, that had the quality of relief mixed with something more complicated. But it was there. It was real. Tyrion had already moved on by the time any of this happened. He was south of Winterfell on the road, doing whatever Tyrion did on long roads. The saddle was not something he had stayed to witness the effect of. He had done the thing, handed it over, and left. He would not have made a ceremony of it regardless. Winterfell continued around this small, real gift. The household settled back into its rhythms. Robb managed things with his quiet seriousness. The forge was lit in the mornings. The cold moved through the high corridors in the way it always had. And Bran lay in his room and thought, for the first time in a long time, about riding. Catelyn Stark had left Winterfell without telling most people where she was going. This was deliberate. She was traveling on a matter that required care. That required the kind of care that is disrupted by announcement, by escort, by the full machinery of a great lady moving through the country with everything that implies. She went with a small group of trusted people, moved quickly, kept to herself. She had been carrying something since the night Bran fell, a physical object, and the conviction that had formed around it. She knew, or believed she knew, something about what had happened to her son, and she was not the kind of person who sat still when she had a course of action available. The Crossroads Inn was exactly the kind of place its name suggested. An inn at the meeting of several major routes, busy by nature, populated by travelers from a variety of directions. It had the particular quality of a place that sees so many people that the individual people stop being remarkable. It was full when Catelyn arrived, and loud in the comfortable way of a full inn in the evening, and she had been given a room and intended to be unremarkable. She came downstairs and found Tyrion Lannister in the common room. For a moment, both of them simply looked at each other. The calculating kind of look that passes between two intelligent people who have each, in a single second, understood that the situation has become something that requires a decision, and that the decision needs to be made quickly. Catelyn had been carrying her conviction a long way. She was Catelyn Tully, daughter of a great lord, wife of Ned Stark, and she had evidence, or what she believed was evidence, that the man sitting at the table in this common room had been involved in an attempt on her son's life. She had been holding this conviction for weeks. She had crossed hundreds of miles holding it. She straightened herself. She addressed the room, not quietly, not privately. She addressed it fully, in the voice of a person of authority, who knows what that authority sounds like when used. She named herself. She named her father, Lord Eddard Tully of Riverrun. She named the men in the room who were bannermen, men who had served her father's house, men who were present by the coincidence of travel, but who owed obligations that were real and not abstract. She named them one by one, speaking to the specific relationship, the specific duty. And then she pointed at Tyrion Lannister and told them what she believed he had done. The room changed. It changed the way rooms change when authority has been invoked clearly and publicly, when there is no longer a comfortable middle ground of not being involved, because involvement has been made the only option. Tyrion watched this. He did not shout. He was not the kind of man who shouted in moments of crisis. He had the particular quality of someone very intelligent under pressure. The sense that he was simultaneously in the present moment and 3 steps ahead of it, running calculations, looking for exits. He said that Catelyn was making a mistake. He said it calmly, with the specificity of a man making a formal record rather than an emotional objection. He wanted it noted. He wanted it on record. He was taken. The men in the room, reminded of their obligations, moved to obey. Tyrion was put under guard, his hands bound. His evening abruptly and entirely changed. He was a prisoner now. A Lannister prisoner. which was a complicated thing to be in Westeros, but a prisoner, nonetheless. He maintained his composure through the process with an impressiveness that had nothing to do with his situation being good, because his situation was clearly not good. He was already thinking. He was already somewhere down the road, looking back at this moment, trying to see what it was the beginning of and what it could be turned into. The group set out. Catelyn with her escort, and Tyrion among them as a prisoner, on a road heading towards the Eyrie and the sister of Catelyn who ruled there, Lysa Arryn, Jon Arryn's widow, who had her own feelings about the Lannisters and her late husband's death. The destination was set. The journey had its own momentum now. The road to the Eyrie was a long one, and not an easy one. The Vale of Arryn was a region of the continent that protected itself through geography as much as through armies. High mountains, narrow passes, routes that wound upward through rock and cloud, rather than running flat and clear the way roads do in more forgiving country. Getting to the Eyrie required getting through the mountains, and getting through the mountains required days of careful travel up trails that grew steeper and colder and more difficult as you climbed. Tyrion understood all of this. He had the map of it in his head, the way he kept many things in his head. Precise, detailed, useful. He walked among the escort with the unhurried manner of a man who is thinking. And he was always thinking. And some of what he was thinking was about what lay ahead, and some of it was about how he was going to manage it when he got there. He had no doubt that Lysa Arryn would not be happy to see him. He had no doubt that arriving as Catelyn's prisoner was not the most advantageous possible version of arriving anywhere. He had doubts, honestly, about whether he was going to leave the Eyrie in the same condition he arrived in, and this was not a comfortable thing to have doubts about. But he was Tyrion Lannister. He had navigated worse situations, with fewer resources, starting from a less interesting hand. He would think, he would talk, he would find something. What would happen when they arrived was a question that would take time to answer. The Khalasar moved through the grasslands in its slow, enormous way, and Viserys Targaryen moved through the Khalasar in the manner of a man watching something slip away from him and not knowing how to stop it. He had a theory about how things were supposed to work. He had maintained this theory through years of exile and difficulty and humiliation in the quiet, invisible ways that people who have been brought low in the world are humiliated. The theory was that he was the rightful king of Westeros, the heir of the Targaryen dynasty, the man who would one day return across the narrow sea with an army and reclaim what was his. The Dothraki were the army. Daenerys was the price that had purchased the army. The arrangement was temporary. The discomfort was temporary. Everything was leading towards the restoration that he had been promised would come. None of it was going how it was supposed to go. He found Daenerys one afternoon in the camp, and the conversation was one of the harder ones they had had, which was saying something given the quality of conversations they'd been having since she was small and afraid of him. He spoke with the clipped authority of someone who needs to hear himself speak in a certain way, to feel that the things he is saying are still true. He had demands, requirements, reminders of what she owed him, and what the arrangement between them meant, and what she was for in the larger scheme of the plan. Daenerys heard him, and then she answered him. This was the thing he hadn't adjusted to, and wasn't adjusting to. She answered him. She had stopped absorbing what he said in the old way, the way that had accommodated his authority without ever exactly accepting it, the way that had let him maintain the performance of control because she wasn't openly challenging it. She had stopped doing that. She spoke with a calm that was its own kind of force, not loud, Not dramatic, not the kind of challenge that announced itself as a challenge. Just steady, present, factual about things, in a way that left little room for the version of reality he needed her to share. She was a Khaleesi. She spoke the language now, well enough to be understood and to understand. She moved through the Khalasar with an ease that he had never managed and had never tried to manage. She had built something real here. A real presence, real relationships, a real role. She had done the things that would have been necessary to do to build these things, and he had done none of them, because doing them would have required acknowledging that this was a world he was actually living in, rather than a temporary stop on the way back to the world he wanted. He had not made that acknowledgement. He was still refusing to make it. The result was that the Dothraki did not respect him, not in the way they respected Daenerys, which was something you could see in how people moved around her, how they spoke when she was present, the particular quality of the attention she was given. With Viserys there was something else, a kind of flat absence of what he was looking for, an indifference that was worse than hostility, because it didn't even grant him the importance of being opposed. His interactions with Khal Drogo had taken on the quality of something moving toward an edge without the ability to stop. Drogo was not a man who engaged in the kind of tense, verbal negotiations that Viserys understood as the medium of power. He operated through something simpler and more absolute. He was simply what he was, and the weight of that was enormous, and it was always there, and Viserys was not equipped to exist comfortably near that weight. The thing Viserys had believed, that Daenerys was his, that the Alliance was his creation, that the Dothraki were his army waiting to be deployed, was becoming, visibly, untrue. And watching it become untrue, without being able to reverse it, was doing something to Viserys that was not making him easier to be around, or more capable of the kind of clear-headedness he needed. He was a man who had spent his whole life telling himself a story, and the story was, piece by piece, not holding up. Sam Tarly had not transformed overnight. That was not how things worked, and Sam would have been the first to say so. He was still slow in the drills, still the last man through most of the physical tasks, still found the cold genuinely difficult in the way of someone whose body had not yet decided to simply accept it as the permanent condition of life. He had not become a fighter. He had not become someone who moved through the training yard with any of the ease that Jon moved through it with. None of the things that had been true about him when he arrived from that wagon had stopped being true. But things around him had changed. Jon's intervention had been real, and its effects were real. The active pushing, the deliberate cruelty of men who needed a target, had stopped. What had replaced it was something between indifference and a grudging recognition. The other recruits had not decided that Sam was one of them in the full sense, but they had stopped deciding that he was a problem they were entitled to address directly. He existed in the yard alongside them, and that was what it was. With the pressure reduced, Sam could breathe more easily. And when Sam could breathe more easily, qualities of his that the pressure had been suppressing became visible. He was funny, in a self-deprecating way that disarmed people. He was genuinely interested in whoever was talking to him, interested in the particular way that makes people feel heard, which is both more rare and more valued than most people acknowledge. He knew things from his reading that came up unexpectedly and usefully in conversations, and he shared them without the air of someone demonstrating their knowledge, just as someone saying a thing that happened to be relevant. The recruits found themselves, in the evenings, less actively hostile toward him. Some of them found themselves to their own mild surprise, slightly fond of him. Jon and Sam settled into an easy routine of talking in the evenings. The common hall would quiet down as the night wore on, the fire burning lower, the men finding their places to sleep one by one, until there were only a few still awake. Sam would talk about things he'd read. He had read widely, in a way that suggested someone who had found, early, that books were safe in a way that a lot of other things weren't, and had gone to them often. He knew about the history of the Watch, hundreds of years of it, the great battles, the long, quiet periods, the names of the commanders who had mattered. He knew about what lay beyond the wall, in the specific way you know about things you've read thoroughly, rather than experienced. Jon listened to him the way you listen to someone who knows something you don't, which is the most useful kind of listening. He asked questions. Sam lit up when he was asked questions, in the way that certain kinds of people light up when they are given the chance to share what they know with someone who actually wants to hear it. Jon's days at Castle Black had found a shape that was different from what he'd expected when he arrived. He was still the best fighter among the recruits. That hadn't changed. But what he did with it had changed. He helped with training now in a real way. Not officially, not with any title. Just in the quiet, ongoing way of someone who has noticed what other people need and has decided to provide it. He adjusted things for specific recruits, showed someone a grip, walked through a movement with someone who was struggling. He did this without calling attention to it. It was simply what he did in the mornings. Sir Alistair Thorne watched and maintained his steady disdain. He found Jon in front of the recruits and found the weak spots in his performance. There were still weak spots. Jon was still learning things, and made sure those weak spots were clearly visible when he found them. He called him Lord Snow with the same deliberate inflection. He maintained in every interaction the message that whatever Jon thought he was doing, it was not impressing anyone who mattered. Jon heard it every time, and every time he held it steady in the same quiet place. The nights at Castle Black were long and dark and cold. The kind of dark that you don't get in cities, or even in places like Winterfell, where there are enough torches and enough courtyards to suggest the presence of other people nearby. The wall made everything beyond it darker by contrast. You could stand in the courtyard on a clear night and look up, and the stars were very bright and very numerous, and the kind of sky you only see in very cold and very empty places. Jon lay in the dormitory on those nights, thinking about the people he had come from. His father, in King's Landing, navigating something that was clearly complicated. Robb at Winterfell, managing a household that had been handed to him earlier than anyone expected. Arya, somewhere in the Red Keep, probably doing something that would have surprised the people who thought they knew what she was doing. Bran in his room, with the long days of not knowing stretching ahead of him. He thought about family as something you carry with you, rather than something you return to. About how the people you belong to don't stop being the people you belong to just because you're somewhere far away from them. The distance doesn't change the belonging. It just changes how the belonging feels. His own belonging was here now, in this cold yard, with these difficult men, with Sam talking about history in the evenings, and Thorne making his contempt visible in the mornings, and the wall standing at the edge of everything, with its 700 feet of ancient ice, and its long memory of what it had been built to hold back. He was finding, to his own quiet surprise, that he was all right. Not happy, exactly. Not settled, not finished with anything. But all right in the specific sense of a person who has found out what their ground is, and is standing on it. The wall was not Winterfell. The Night's Watch was not the family he had grown up in. But it was real, and it was his, and he was becoming someone here in the way that he had not quite been able to become someone anywhere he'd been before. That counted for something. The fire burned low in the common hall. The last few men found their blankets and their quiet. Outside, the wind came down from the north with its constant, low sound. The sound of all that empty country, all those miles of dark forest, all that cold. And the wall stood against it, the way it had stood against it for thousands of years. And Castle Black went to sleep, and that is where we leave them tonight. Jon Snow, standing on his own ground for the first time. Sam, in his bunk, probably still reading by the last of the light. Arya, in King's Landing, her body remembering that morning's footwork lesson even in sleep. Ned, in his apartments at the Red Keep, with a book of family trees open on the table in front of him, and a question forming in the back of his mind that he is not quite ready to say out loud. Daenerys, out on the grass in the direction of the rising sun, finding out who she is in a world that is entirely different from the world she started in. Tyrion, somewhere on a road at night, his hands bound, already thinking. They are all midway through something, which is, if you think about it, where people always are, in the middle of becoming who they're going to be, in the middle of the story, which is the only place a story exists. The fires are low in King's Landing tonight. The stars are sharp and numerous above Castle Black. The grass of the Dothraki Sea moves in a quiet, steady wind, and the camp is settling into sleep. You can settle too. There is no hurry. The story will be here when you come back to it. It always is. Let the sounds around you soften. Let your breathing slow. Let the world of Westeros grow quiet at the edges, and let the quiet carry you. Good night. If you are still awake, try our other movie story videos. Subscribe if you liked the video. Thanks.